Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk. Cool. Just gonna jump in. Just to start a bit about me. So my name is Romain. I'm a software engineer. I'm currently working for a company called Monzo. So we're basically a UK-based bank. I've been there for about 4 years, doing Android for about 14 years. I call myself a balanced engineer. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. I've been doing that for about 7 years. Work for companies of various sizes, while Deliveroo, Soundkick, Microsoft, Babacar. I'm a dad, a husband. If I start whispering, it's because I've rehearsed that talk when my daughter was sleeping, so apologies about that. I'm based in a lovely city called Auch in South France, the land of duck coffee and foie gras, lovely part of the world. Anyway, today my talk is about collaboration. So the title suggests that it's going to be about backend collaboration, but to be honest, like there's many tips apply to all kinds of engineers. The idea is basically how can we collaborate as engineers? How can we improve our working behaviors to work better together? Simple, right? Cool. So I'm going to start with a simple question. So what was it like when you started making apps? So you may have started building apps like 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Things change, right? Like it's a fast-moving industry. Things keep changing every day. So how has it changed? How was it back then? How is it now? The first thing that may come to mind is like technology, right? Like there's a few things that have changed in the past 15 years. Like when I think about how it was when I started building apps, I would start Eclipse on my low-key laptop. It would take ages. I would love it, but yeah, that was how it was. I was use Java as a language. Not having fun with that. Happy that we moved on. I was using Jake Wharton's library, Action Bar Sherlock, which was kind of the Jetpack Compose of the time. It was doing a lot of things. I was actually using Green Droid from Cyril Motti as well at the time. But yeah, many things have changed quite a lot, right? I had nightmares of the activity lifecycle. I still do, to be honest. It's a bit traumatizing in a way. There was no Gradle, no Kotlin, no Compose, no Dagger. It was just basically you and your lovely barebone Android SDK 2.2 Froyo. And the funny thing is that this room is 2.2, so I love when planet aligns like that. Anyway, when you think about how it was back then, another thing that may have changed is like, collaboration, right? Like the collaboration with the outside world. When you think about how it was, how you would be interacting as an Android engineer with other kind of engineers, you might think that it's a bit different to how it is today. A common pattern at the time was to have teams around specific specialization. So you'd have like mobile teams or Android iOS team, depending on the size of the company. You would have like web teams, backend teams, teams of designers, product managers, and so on. So people would just kind of sit together within the company. You could see that. And so as a result, you would have like backend doing backend, Android doing Android, and so on. I think like this is basically an image, but I think it was a bit like as if people were working in little cubicles, and you had to open that gate to speak to the other team. So it would take an extra effort. And all of this may work nicely for small companies. It was not really scalable, so you would see a lot of teams not using all their capabilities effectively. An example is you would have like mobile teams introducing external cookie cutter solutions to address the problem instead of investing time to build it properly. So, for example, if you take, I don't know if you know Pusher, like I don't have anything against Pusher, but like, for example, this was the kind of tool that mobile teams would kind of integrate to just get like push notification for free. Like Pusher is basically a library that you add to your backend, to your client, and then that's it, you have like push notification. That's great. But if you think about it, it's not like a very complex engineering problem to solve. And it's something that you could solve internally if you have like the right people to come together within the company. So I'm not saying that this is the only reason why we were using Get solution at the time, but I think it was one reason for that. I think things started changing in around 2014, I think, and that kind of coincided with when Spotify released a series of blog posts called their engineering culture, and I think essentially the way they work by the, I don't know if it dates or works like that, but yeah, they had like what they call squads, who's usually a product manager, a designer, engineers of various kinds, and maybe QA, XO. And then you would have like tribes to sensibly group squads. And then finally you would have like what they call guilds, which is like transversal squads solving a common business problem. And I think like thinking about it, this was kind of a groundbreaking changes in the engineering culture. And we all started working beyond their specialization, and instead of focusing on their or on Android or on iOS, they would actually work together to focus on a product. Thinking about Cyril talk this morning, I'm conscious that cross-platform teams have like bring on some kind of complexity, but when you think about it, it also helps collaborating beyond specialization. And today it's a standard in the engineering world. A lot of companies have adopted similar setups with cross-platform teams. And I think, yeah, they got everyone closer, but did it solve everything? Maybe not, right? You might be wondering what this lady is doing on my talk here. Me too, to be honest. I just wasn't sure what to put on that side, so there we go. This is Ayana Kamura, famous French artist with over 8 million monthly hits on Spotify. She can write great lyrics like the one I've translated here. What I'm trying to communicate here is that you may have the best setup with cross-platform teams, well-defined roles, very capable people. If they don't come with the right intention or the right behavior, you're missing a point. Cool. I'm not going to sing the song. Well, maybe later on, but false. Yeah, today we see more and more Android engineers who are not solely focused on Android engineer. And I think that's quite interesting, right? There is this concept of T-shaped engineer, where like when you think about it, like your job is only about like producing Android code, right? You might be kind of strong at other things. So basically the concept of T-shaped engineer is that you put your main strength in the middle, maybe platform knowledge, language knowledge, and then you might be strong at communication. You might be empathetic. You might be have some kind of skills on UI, UX, and so on, right? There's like plenty of things that you put in there. So when you think about like collaboration, it's basically everyone coming with their like strengths and kind of trying to work together to make that work. It's a bit conceptual, but I think it's quite interesting to think about. Like, just take a moment and think about like, what are you good at? Like, what's your all your strength? And earlier on, I talked about like the concept of balanced engineer. I saw that concept from a developer called Brittany Olick. She has like this newsletter called Balanced Engineer. And it's essentially the idea is basically that balanced engineer is a generalist thought. Someone to understand that the best solution often come from combined with a wide variety of skills, experiences, and perspective. Basically, like you're not only an Android engineer, right? You have this kind of skills, and basically, when you come in front of a problem, you have to try to think of which tool to actually use to solve that problem. Cool. So yeah, I've thrown like quite a lot of buzzwords and concepts and so on, but like, what does it mean in practice here? So like from now on, I'm just gonna like try to have a look at the let's say that we want to build a feature, and let's see how we can approach that with all these behaviors in mind. Yeah, one nice thing that I like to see when I start working on a project is to start with a proposal. At Monzo, we start anything with a proposal, to be honest. A proposal is like an RFC, a request for comment, and RFC is basically a nice way to draft out the needs of your project before jumping to its execution. RFCs are older than the web, and in fact, they actually help build the web. A lot of concepts in the web, on HTTP protocols and so on, were defined by the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, and they maintain an index of all their RFCs. They actually define a lot of things from RFCs, which can get accepted or not, and they are all available on this datatracker.ietf.org. I recommend you looking into that. That's super interesting. You have like RFCs from like the 1969, so it's quite interesting. And they have that tradition to publish one or more April Fool RFC documents every year. Among the most famous is the Hypertext Coffee Pot Control Protocol, which is basically a protocol to make coffee. And that RFC introduced the HTTP code 418. I am a teapot, so it's actually, yeah, quite famous. not useful at all, but it's like it included a lot of HTTP library like OKHTTP and so on. Anyway, you don't need to be building the web to use RFCs. You can actually use that to to define like smaller features, smaller projects, and so on. This is a template of a RFC. So basically, you would start with like a little TLDR, like what are you trying to do? What's the goal of this document and what is it solving? Then you set the scene, like why are you solving this? Like adding some kind of data. You add any details of like just to explain why are we tackling this. Then the proposed implementation. This is like the main part of your RFC. Like what is your solution to this? And I think the next session is quite interesting as well. Are there any other options that you've considered? Because like there may be other solutions to solve this, right? How do they compare to the solution that you picked, and why didn't you pick that solution over this one, and so on. And then yeah, you could put like any kind of section in there, like any kind of metrics. How do you track progress? How do you track success of this feature? And then any testing strategy, any how are you gonna be alerted by any issue, and so on. So basically, the idea of this document, well, actually, this document is quite focused on like implementation, code changes, and so on. But you could actually use that for anything, right? At Monzo, we use it for like recently we used it to discuss how we can improve our rituals and so on. So it's like basically it's just a document to explain what you're proposing to change and how, and just to have it run line, right? Yeah, so as I said, like the idea is that it's a nice way to propose new ideas. So you could actually have like anyone in the department just like create an RFC just to get like feedback. It's a nice way to think through a problem. Sometimes like when you just write down thoughts, it's easier to just like explain what you have in mind. And the main thing about proposal is like it's a good way to gather feedback. So you would use something like Notion or I don't know, Google Docs or whatever you prefer, GitHub PRs on RFCs, so that you have like people commenting like, oh, I wouldn't use that, I wouldn't do this way, and so on. And at some point, like everyone, well, you change the proposal based on feedback, and at some point, well, you align on a decision, right? And that's key because then you know that all your team is happy with this change, right? So you can just move on and build the thing. And also the nice added benefit is that like 2 years later, if you're wondering why you took that decision back then you can just always come back to that document, and there will be a nice explanation. You could actually see some feedback, that person agreed with that, and so on. So basically, it's a nice way to build documentation in a very, very natural way, I guess. When I write a proposal, I like putting my researcher cap and check out the existing code in other systems, iOS, backend. It's always interesting to understand what's in place and to learn from it. With that research and mindset, you get to weigh the pros and cons of different options. Basically, without that proposal stage, it's just easy to just say like, I'm gonna go with this option, and then you spend a week just building, that new implementation, and then you reach the PR stage, and then you have someone who said like, oh, why did you do that? Like, there was an easier way to do that, or we don't need that, etc., etc. Basically, you would have wasted a week of just building something for nothing, and you would be creating tech debts and so on. So basically, yeah, writing a proposal is not wasted time. When I write a proposal for technical changes, well, you may want to bring changes to communication with your backend services. API design discussions are particularly interesting in proposals. They can often be a good place to agree how the overall system will behave with the change you're proposing. When I refer to API, well, I mean backend API, but to be honest, like a lot of concepts here would apply to any kind of API that you would use. And it's quite common to see an API contract like something that belongs to backend engineers, right? Because, well, at the end of the day, they write like the kind of backend services and so on. In many companies, backend engineers provide an API and client engineers make the client consume it. As a result, API design decisions may not be tailored to the application needs, and they may result into like, unnecessary complexity on the client. It's usually like more constructive to see the API contract as something that sits between the backend and the client, right? It's At the end of the day, it's a contract, right? It's something that everyone needs to agree on, and everyone should have their say, right? One thing I've seen particularly effective to enforce the API contract is to use something called Open API, previously known as Swagger. Open API lets you define your API contract in a YAML file, and then based on that YAML file, you just generate some code. You have like loads of code generators that could generate that code. So basically, whatever you're using, whatever technology you're using on the back end on your clients, then you'll find something for you. So basically, yeah, for example, it has like generators for Go, for retrofit interfaces and so on. And the very interesting thing about that is that with using Open API, it extracts the API contract away from the backend code base. So you could actually have like a separate GitHub repository with your YAML API contract definition, and basically that's just then you move ownership of it, right? It's no longer owned by backend engineers. It's something that everyone owns. So you could have like client engineers contributing to these API contract changes, or backend engineers, and so on. And going one step further, you could actually generate some public multi-platform. If all your systems supports that, you could actually generate just like one layer, and that layer would be used by all your parties. Obviously, it heavily depends on the technology that you use, but yeah, could be an interesting thing. And with that, it's not only sharing the API contract, you're actually sharing the actual implementation, so that's even better. If you think about like how that would work, like if you had like backend engineers only defining APIs, you usually land with something that looks like this. I would call that a general purpose API. If you take the Android Maker's app, well, you could have like one API that defines it like that, right? It's not bad. It's just, when you think about it, it's a list of events, right, that we're presenting to the screen with like, raw data, an ID, a name, a room, a language, and so on. Problem is that if you deliver this kind of API, then it's up to the client to present it the way it wants it, right? So for example, that 1145 header here is coming from a timestamp, so it could be presented in a different way on each client, right, on Android and iOS. So basically, yeah, it could lead to inconsistency, which is not ideal. Another way to approach that is, instead of focusing on your domain models, your entities, you're focusing on your UI. So when you think about it, this screen is a list of tabs, and in each tab you have like a list of sections, and in each section you have like list of items, and you don't need to send like a timestamp here. You can just like send like a formatted times and so on. I think this is like more client focused, right? It's easier to read to the client, and it leads to more consistency across platforms. And nice added benefit is that if you want to make a presentational change, for example, if I want to remove the duration of the talk here, I just need to make a deployment on my backend. I don't need to do anything on the client. I don't need to release a new app version. So it's a nice added benefit. One drawback is that it usually leads to more loading spinners in the app, because obviously this data, you won't be able to reuse it in another screen. If you go to a detailed screen, for example, you'll have to make another API call to actually show that data. So, well, I'm not saying that you should use that, but it's just one tool to consider when you build your API. Yeah. So so how would that look like in practice? So, well, a backend for frontend is just like a backend layer that sits between your general purpose API and your clients. And it's just basically a layer that kind of mashes up the data and return that nicely to your client. And you could actually have like a different backend front end depending on your kind of client, because at the end of the day, the web might present that in a different way than your clients, your mobile clients. And why am I talking about this in this talk? Well, I think it's also nice for collaboration, right? Because it brings the team closer. When you think about it, client engineers will have to will end up contributing to this backend front end layer, because it's basically solving client client requirements, right? It's thinking about presentation, navigation, and so on. So you're going to end up having like client actually contributing to the backend a bit more. And at the end of the day, you'll have also like backend engineers contributing to this backend front-end thing, because it's a backend layer, and they will have to think a bit more about presentation while client needs, right? They will have to think about presentation and navigation as well. So yeah, I think it's a benefit for team collaboration as well. You might have noticed that URI thing, and I think URIs are a very underused thing in the mobile world. For example, in Android, you can define an interfilter for a certain URI, right? And you'd probably want to use that to make certain screens available from outside your app. But when you think about it, you could actually use that for internal foundations, right? Because if you provide any screen with deep link, you'll be able to deep link into any part of your app with just a URI and from your backend. And again, that leads to less app releases, because you could just make like a new backend deployment, and then that updates the root of one item. So it's very underused, but I think it's super powerful. Cool. So now we have like a very nice proposals. So it should be clear to everyone what they should do, right? And when you think again about that concept of balanced engineer, someone who has interest in combining like all their kind of different skills contributing across the stack will have some kind of superpower at this stage, because they have a better overview of the whole system, right? Like if they know what happens on the back end, if they know what happens on the client, well, they can see the bigger picture, and they would know what could break, what is covered by our testing. When something breaks on the other side, they don't need to wait for someone to look into it. They can just do it themselves. But if you haven't already, just speak to your favorite backend engineers in the team and try to book a pairing session with them, and you'll see that it's not as hard as it may look like. You could even do like a follow-up reverse session and teach how to do Android. Another way to make a first step in the backend world is to regularly check your fellow backend engineers' pull requests. See how they make changes, try to understand if something is unclear, ask questions, make suggestions. It can be an incredible learning resource. When there's something I don't know how to do, I just search through the code base if there's not a similar example. And if something in the code doesn't make sense, I just do a git blame and try to see why something wasn't introduced that way. Yeah, another way to get other engineers closer to your Android pipeline is to polish your onboarding documentation. Some companies provide like an onboarding documentation for new joiners, explaining like any kind of custom thing that you might do, like for example, modularization, architecture, CI pipeline, release processes. It's super useful for new joiners, and it can get outdated if you don't have a lot of new joiners regularly. It's actually key to think about it as something that documents your code base for everyone, including people within the company, right? At Monzo, the onboarding documentation is like so polished, and on every system, like Android, iOS, web, backend, even data. And it's so polished that even engineers within the company use the onboarding documentation if they want to contribute to the other platform. As a result, you have like a lot of mobile engineers, actually here, who do a lot of backend engineers, a lot of backend basically, because they have been through that onboarding documentation, and they feel like, well, they know like the basics after reading that. The cleaner your documentation is, the more appealing it will be to engineers on other platforms. And the more tools you share, the easier it will be to collaborate with other engineers. For example, it's quite common that mobile engineers that use their own solutions. For example, continuous integration. BEFFROI is a good example for that. It's great. I've used that in a few companies, but when you think about it, it's like, continuous integration doesn't have to be tailored to mobile needs. You could even, there is benefit to use a shared CI tool. Like if you use, for example, Circle CI across your stack, on backend, on Android, and so on, then if you are stuck, like trying to solve something, you have like more people to reach out to get help from. So there is value in actually having like more or less the same tool on each platform. Okay, so we've built the thing, and it's time to run a test party. Sorry, Mr. Bean, not that exciting. Right, testing party. What is a testing party? It's basically just you get everyone in a room to play around with the new feature that you built, and you basically try to break it and see how it behaves in certain conditions and so on. You will usually start from a test plan, which is basically like a list of all test cases, how to test each of the thing, and try to think about all the edge cases. So why am I bringing that up? Test parties is also a nice way to basically shift ownership, because in a lot of companies you have like, client engineers who actually own the end user testing. They will actually play around with what they like the user fronting changes. So they would actually try to break it themselves, or you would have like a quality engineer who does that. But it should actually be the entire squad responsibility here to do that. So in testing party, you would include everyone, like backend engineers, Android engineers, iOS, product managers, designer, anyone who's contributed one way or the other, and try to see if like everyone comes with their perspective and try to see if it works on all parts. Mention the test plan. Well, here is how it could look like. But yeah, it's just any template would do. Basically, you just need a way to list all your test cases, and a way also to record who's tested what. Did it break? Did it not break? Record test, results, screenshots, and so on. Cool. So the feature is built, it's tested, and we can now ship it. And during that phase, again, there's also like a lot of interesting discussion that can happen between Android and backend engineers, right? About how to roll out that thing. And again, there are like different options. Well, the most natural one is to just like, release the thing, right? Say that we have that new feature available to our new version 1.1, and well, everyone is happy, it works nicely, and you ship it, and well, you're no longer happy because it's actually buggy, it's actually breaking the entire app. Too bad. You have to, well, spend a bit more time on it and try to solve it. You fix it in that version 1.2. And the issue with that is that, well, the fix may take a bit of time to get to customers, right? Because you may spend like, I don't know, a few days to actually find the actual fix. It's going to take time to actually reach out to customers because, well, Google Play rollout may take time. Some users will be stuck on 1.1 forever because they don't have automatic update enabled in Google Play. So not ideal. One kind of simple way to solve that is to use feature flags. And so when your app starts, they would just fetch like a list of feature flags from your backend services or third party or whatever you want to use. And then it would just have some kind of logic in the code that says, if my feature is enabled, then show it. If not, don't. Well, that kind of solved that problem that we would have, right? Like if we had like a bug on 1.1, I can just disable my feature flag on the back end, and that's it. 1.1 is okay again. And then I release a 1.2, enabling the feature on your 1.2, keeping it disabled on all the versions, and that's all good. One issue with that's well, you'll have to come back to it and clean up the if condition that you've added to check if the feature flag was enabled or not later on, and clean up the code on the client. So one more app releases. And so one way to solve that, app release cleanup thing is to use the backend side logic. So if I think again about my backend for front-end thing, if I backend drive the whole thing with including presentation, navigation, I should have like enough tool to actually have that if condition, if my feature enabled on the backend instead of on the client. And so, for example, I don't know, if my feature just opens a separate screen, then I can use a different URI depending of if my feature is enabled or not. And that's actually quite powerful because I don't need to do any cleanup anymore on the client. I will still have to juggle with my feature enable or not, depending if 1.1 is broken here, but that's fine, right? You might be saying, well, you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's great, but then we need to do the cleanup on the backend later on, right? And you would be right. But that would actually happen with like the previous version as well. So let's say that like after like n releases on 1.1, we want on 1.n, we want to, clean up the backend code because we don't want to have that forever, right? Well, there's an option called version deprecation. So when your app starts, it would just like fetch a flag from the backend and say like, am I deprecated? If I'm not deprecated, I'm just going to show the usual experience. If I am deprecated, I just block everything, show a screen that says, hey, update your app. And then that's actually a very powerful solution because if you increment the version regularly, so that, for example, you have like 6 months worth of non-deprecated versions, then you can just always assume that any version that is older than 6 months ago could be deprecated. And so on the back end, it's actually super useful because it helps clean up some unused code. So for example, API services that are only used by older versions could be removed completely. And on the client, it's actually quite useful as well because it means less app versions to maintain, right? So you don't need to worry about like any kind of crash that was happening on versions that were older than 6 months ago. So yeah, very powerful. Why am I talking about that? Well, it's also a nice way to, I think it's an example of collaboration, something that if you approach this problem with just only the client mindsets, you're not going to be able to solve it. But actually, if you think about the overall system, taking into account like backend and client, you can actually come with like a more elegant solution there. We've previously talked about like getting backend engineers to contribute to mobile apps and vice versa. Another good way to share context of the mobile world to backend engineers is to simplify the install process of your app. So there is something called dogfooding, basically installing a nightly, basically having some kind of CI pipeline that installs, that deploys nightly builds on a nightly basis. Basically a production version of your app on a nightly basis. And why is that important for collaboration? It's also another way, again, to shift ownership because if you have only client engineers testing the app until it gets to customer with the release, then they might not have like the entire, mindset, and that's actually a smaller pool of users to actually test your app before it reaches out to customers. But if you dogfood it, well, if you ship it internally to, I don't know, an alpha channel or beta channel who are only targeted by people within your company, then you're increasing that pool. So you have like basically more users actually testing the app before it goes out. And the same thing with like master and PR builds. If you have like a CI pipeline that deploys your staging version, the staging version of your app, whenever there's like a push on master or pull request to something called something like Firebase app distribution, there are other solutions there, then it's no longer the responsibility of the client engineer to test everything, right? They can, whenever client engineers make the changes, they can just say, hey, backend engineer, like my changes are available. When you're ready to test it on your backend side, you can just install it from, my PR on your phone, and then that's it, right? So yeah, another way to kind of shift ownership there. And another thing that I've discovered at Monzo, which is actually also very powerful, is to build an internal command line to install your app easily. So at Monzo, we call it driod. It's basically an internal tool that we use to enable a lot of common things that any engineer would want to use on staging. So for example, if you want to install a certain branch, if you want to install a certain release, if you want to log the user in, log the user out, set up a proxy, enable feature flag, and so on, we have commands for that, basically. Any Android engineer will know how to do that, right? To build the app. But if you have someone who doesn't have that knowledge, then it's like they won't be able to do it themselves, so they will have to ask you. If you have like a simple command that they can run to abstract all these like complexity they don't know, then that's all for them, right? And so we have that tool at Monzo, and we have like loads of people who are not Android engineers who use it on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, super interesting. So yeah, as I said, like sometimes we like putting gates between us, and it's easy to label ourselves like, I'm an Android engineer, I'm a backend engineer. And through this talk, I just want to give you a taste of what it's like to open these gates sometimes, right? We sometimes see these tips and techniques as ways to be like more productive at our job. But it's also, I think, a great way to learn how to enjoy the ride with our colleagues a little more. So yeah, that's me. Thanks a lot. If you have any question about this or Aya Nakamura, I'd be really happy to answer that.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about especially like getting feedbacks and RFC and all that kind of stuff. So in my company, we started as a startup and we are like just scaling, and it gets more and more difficult to like be able to know how to involve the right people and how to request comments to the right people, or the one that would be interested, or that just will make the effort to contribute. Do you have also these kind of problems, or do you have solutions to be able for each RFC to identify and to ping only the ones that will be really interested to contribute to it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It also depends on the scale of the thing that you're talking about in your RFC, right? If it's like a very small thing, well, maybe you just want to involve like, people within your squad, and you don't need to involve everyone. But like, obviously, if you need like to if you need to involve like a lot more people, then you would actually share that with the entire company, or I know, more tribes or whatever you call that. So yeah, I guess it depends on the size of the problem, mostly. I think the tricky pattern that I've seen on proposals which like do a lot of things that is that you gather a lot of feedbacks, right? Because everyone has an opinion, and then you have to actually make like some kind of reasoning of that mess. So I think also the key thing is to have your RFC like targeting, like focusing on one single problem at a time, and not having it spread out too thin. Yeah, but yeah, it really depends on the use cases, I think.
Thank you for the talk. Very, very instructive. I had a question about backend for front-end strategy that you use. Mainly the issue I see with this is that if the UI changes a bit and we're still keeping the old versions available, there is possibilities that we're going to silently break something that's older. How do you deal with this without having issues for older versions?
Yeah, that's again a great question. I think the example that I shared was a bit simplistic in terms of UI representation, because it's like obviously like very tied to the UI. So if something breaks, as you said, if something changes, then it's going to break later. I think an approach that I've seen much more effective is to have the API very, very abstract. So basically using polymorphism a bit more, like saying like basically this, an item that describes an event is just one kind of thing that could show on that list. There could be anything that shows on that list. And then in the future, you could actually just switch based on the type of item, and say, it's like, if it's like a simple list item, then I'm using that old version. If it's just my new kind of item, then I can just like, remove that completely and use something else. Yeah, we've actually invested a lot of time at Monzo to do this, and we have now this like common UI framework which is shared in like many screens, and it's got like loads of different kind of items. And there's like a squad actually owning it and making sure that whatever gets in is validated before And also like leaning on documentation as well is very important, because obviously like trying to document what's available, what's yeah. But yeah, okay, yeah, it's a tricky one. I think you need owners for this to work.
Same here. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Very insightful. Two questions. The first one was about trying to push backend engineers touch a bit the front end and front end engineers touch a bit the back end. My own experience was that when you do that, you end up having more T-shaped profiles, so having multiple skills, but less I-shaped profiles, so not capable of deep diving. How do you balance between that? Because like having people touching everything is nice, but at the same time, you have a lack of something, like you miss something, which is going beyond what's supposed to be or considered possible.
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. I think, yeah, I'm not saying through this talk that everyone should be T-shaped, and we had a discussion actually yesterday that there are some. I think it depends on everyone's interest, right? Like some people would be more interested in being generalists, and some people would be like more interested in like deep diving into one thing. So I think it depends also on the engineering culture here, like what are you pushing for? And taking into account people preferences there, and not closing doors and saying like everyone should be a generalist at heart. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And my second question was more about you mentioned sharing tools, sharing languages. My own experience with that is that it's awesome, but it breaks barriers. So we can use, for instance, let's say Kotlin on the client and on the back end, and it ends up very easy to actually depend on a dependency that will end up on both the server and on the back end, and it blows up completely the complexity of the code base, as well as it blows up the app size, for instance. How do you balance? How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? Like, do you have this problem at some point of having people adding a dependency very easily everywhere in the code base, and it ends up in the backend or in the mobile, even if it's not useful?
I'm not entirely sure to understand the question. Sorry.
But I can give you an example. But for instance, if we do Rust as a multi-platform approach to share code, like we have Rust running on the backend, but also Rust running on the client. And so because it's Rust, they just have to add a dependency. So let's say they need SQLite, they had a dependency. And sometimes it ends up also in the backend, which is not a super huge problem on the backend. But if it's the opposite, if you add a dependency that is backend only on the client, you end up having an app that is 100 megabytes, for instance, and people, they don't see that because it's so easy to add a dependency that they don't see this problem.
Yeah,
do you have these issues, or?
I know because we don't share languages that much. I think we try to have like we keep things like, you know, Go on the back end, Kotlin, and then Swift, and then JavaScript on the web. But like there's no, so basically, yeah, we like when I mentioned the Kotlin multi-platform thing, that's not something that we've heavily invested on. But so we're investing more on the you know, open API thing, which is like just abstracting your changes, and then you can generate that code in any way you want to. I'd agree that sounds a bit risky, but I guess you would want to limit that somehow. But yeah, I'm not too sure. Sorry. Yeah.
As everyone said, thank you. First question, simple enough. You said you have your CLI that allows installation of apps really easily. Is that open source by any chance?
So you mean like the
driod command?
The driod command. Yeah, no, because it's so tailored to our needs that it wouldn't be super useful for other people. Maybe some things could be interesting, like I don't know. Yeah, even though, yeah, I think you would need to build it for your own needs, because yeah, I don't think it's it would work that well as an open source thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Second question was, when you showed the different APIs, the different parameters for backend configuration for releases, does that include the backend versions, their APIs? Because worked on with multiple different backends that have a tendency to update request and response formats without informing anyone, and everything breaks, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we changed that 3 weeks ago." And
Yeah, it's so it's are you talking about the open API thing, or are you talking about
in
the
general, I'm saying if you change the parameter
Yeah.
is deprecated to true to false, you kind of have to change the API to version it in some sense.
that kind of sounds like a problem of culture as well.
Yeah.
In a way. But I would say that something like OpenVPN actually helps with that, because you like, again, backend don't own the API anymore. It's something that is owned by everyone, so you can actually have like some kind of automation that makes sure that the API is not changed whenever without clients knowing about it. Yeah, it's not something that I've seen that much, but to be honest, I think it's also like kind of a problem of yeah, of culture. I feel like it's something that could be solved with automations here.